Thank you everyone for tuning in this week for our telehealth failure secret to success for Craig. And well, I'm pretty excited to talk with Craig. I actually know him quite some time now. We chat quite a bit about broadband and the impact on healthcare. I guess, Craig, before we start, can you just share a little bit about your background? How did you get interested in broadband? How did you get, interested in telehealth?
Okay, so I'm not actually gonna. Whoops. Once I know where I'm going, there we go. So my background is 30 years of helping cities, actually helping people in general, understand technology and how to make the business case of using this technology in their school or business or whatever, where you're basically trying to use the technology to save money, make money, or run your organization more effectively, right? So that's what I do for a living. It's just I've gone from um, helping people understand a specific technology or product to now I talk about this thing called community broadband, where it's a city being building a network to improve various aspects of the city and the people that live and work there. So with this grounding, what I call 20 years of being working with um, tech companies, right? I basically feel that the marketing of those services or products, or now we're talking about categories of products, whether we're talking about broadband or talking about telehealth, so this whole thing of marketing, right? Generally, it's talking about Marcom, public relations, and so forth, but you're basically trying to either take advantage of opportunities or you're trying to get rid of obstacles in your way of having a successful um, product, right? So now we talk about broadband as a category, and so policy is either an obstacle or an opportunity, right? And so as I was going around talking about broadband in general, um, I had a stroke 3 years ago, and what I call this stroke of insight, no, well, pun intended, um, is that I'm in the hospital dealing with all these issues and the treatment and the rehab. There were various things that were made easier because of high speed internet. I mean, my doctor, um, when I went to the ER, she was actually 45 minutes away
Mhm.
on a
Wow.
computer
Yeah.
watching my process and figuring out if I needed to have certain type of medication and so forth.
Yeah.
That was all done through broadband, right? And so the insight was um, so many people in rural areas and in urban areas, they don't have good broadband to enable them to have better
Mm.
health care.
Okay.
And as I went forward, from the stroke, and I started understanding more and more about the various technologies that run over broadband, what I realized is that um, telehealth has a great opportunity to change how people are dealing not just with um, healthcare in the hospital, but like I said, the rehab, the mental health aspect of it, the living healthy aspect of your life after you have a serious um, uh, uh, situation like a stroke
Yeah.
or a heart attack or what have you. And so that's how I started to really move forward, because I became to understand the correlation between um, telehealth and broadband. You know, the
Okay.
thing I said, that if you don't have good broadband, you don't have good telehealth. And if you don't have good
Okay.
telehealth, you're going to shortchange people until they get this kind of, making best use of the technology.
Got it. I got it. Great. So quick, then maybe we could like turn the floor to you. Maybe you can share some insight on your presentation. Then after that, we're gonna open up to the audience, just
Sure.
questions. Yeah.
No problem. See, to make sure we're rock and rolling here. Okay, so I look at policy and broadband. Okay, because if you have good broadband policy, right, you will have a platform for getting your telehealth applications and services to the people that need it the most. If you have really bad policy, um, this becomes a problem. Getting telehealth out there becomes a thing. Um, the telehealth world has done, in my mind, a pretty good job of rallying support within Congress and the White House for telemedicine. I think that's a very good thing. I think that there needs to be an equal effort to address broadband, right? Coming back to the whole thing, if I have good broadband, I'll have good telehealth, and vice versa, right? But you have to understand the particulars of the broadband, policies and so forth. And so what I want to do is go through some of the issues of federal, state, and local policies, and how they play with what you want to do in telehealth. What I would ideally like to see are the people that are building these community networks would meet up with the telemedicine folks, the vendors, the association, and so forth, and we come together, because that becomes a counter to the incumbents way trying to get policies that do not benefit either broadband or telehealth. So if I look at the federal level, right? So I think a lot of us have familiarized with the net neutrality, and so the basis of net neutrality is that we have one group of folks who want to make sure that we have good access for everybody, um, small towns, big towns, whatever. And why this is important is that you don't want to have your telehealth applications get hung up because of the relationship with one ISP, one internet service provider, has with another. They're trying to get the competitive advantage, right? And so you don't want to have telehealth become hostage of the marketing whims of the various um, incumbents, large telephone and cable companies. Um, Another aspect of federal policy it deals with the speed issue, right? We have what's called what is it 25 megs speed download, and 3 megabits up, right? What this means at a practical level for the telemedicine folks is that you need to have uh, adequate speed in order to get your uh, products and services, um, make that available to your customers, or the hospitals or clinics, or whoever is part of this telemedicine process, right? So the speed is a big deal. Well, there are folks within the folks within Congress and within the White House and so forth that are trying to lower the speed rather than raise it. And this has an effect on how you get money that goes out to build the broadband networks and the operation of those networks after they've been built. So you got to pay attention to that issue, and where I'll talk about a little bit which parts of the telemedicine world can deal with federal policy in this area. But basically, you got net neutrality, you got speed, you've got broadband funding, right? Because who gets money determines how well broadband gets advanced especially in rural areas and low-income urban areas. And so, like for example, today or yesterday, news comes out that the FCC is going to make $500 million available for broadband build-outs. That sounds great, but you have to look at the rules for determining who gets that money. And will it be the people who are actually building networks that are super fast, or are we going to get money going to people who basically give us very inadequate broadband, right? And then municipal broadband is an area that could become more of a federal policy discussion than a state policy discussion. But understand that if the federal branch decides that they want to make it illegal for cities to build broadband, there are a lot of rural areas that would not have broadband without having their cities, their counties being able to do that. At the state level, we're starting to see states like Hawaii, Montana, New York, New Jersey, where they are passing rules to reinstate net neutrality. So, in other words, the ability to have, um, you know, equal access to broadband that's now has been taken away at the federal level. Now the states are saying we're going to ensure that there is net neutrality. Um, States are where you have some of the bigger issues of speed. For example, in California and Tennessee, both of these states set the qualification for what makes broadband what broadband is. They have lowered the bar, and that's a discussion that should have been attacked at the beginning of the last legislative session, right? Because what that means here in California, which is where I'm at, or in Tennessee, is that you're gonna have problems getting broadband and subsequently telehealth to those rural folks in those respective states. There's another state issue, which is this thing called carrier of last resort. Everyone who takes money from the feds or from states have requirements to provide some sort of broadband service or telecom service to rural areas. If you remove those, you'll have a situation like you have in Texas, where hurricane comes in, devastates the infrastructure, and the telephone companies have no responsibility to replace that. So, just think about that for a second. So again, if you're trying to get telemedicine out to rural areas of Texas, and they get no ability to replace the infrastructure that was there, right? What are who are you going to sell your telemedicine applications to? you hear a lot today about small cells, right? Which is all usually talked about in the realm of 5G. You need to have what are basically these actually big, um, uh, God, what are they? Transmitters that enable you to have 5G, right? Well, if you don't have the if you don't have good policy that addresses those small cells, you will affect, or you have the potential to affect negatively those people that typically don't get good broadband to begin with. So you have to pay attention to that and lobby and do whatever you have to do in order to keep that avenue open. And the last area is the municipal broadband. If you go to my website, which is CJ Speaks, I have a report that lists all of the states where they have prohibited community-owned networks. Okay, this is important. Again, if you go to, if you're trying to get your telemedicine, telehealth products out to rural areas of North Carolina, South Carolina, Louisiana, there are 50, no, 20 states that have various levels of restrictions on municipal broadband. If you want to ensure that cities and communities are able to build the infrastructure to have better broadband, then these restrictions have to be addressed. And usually, what we have seen in the past is that every year there are one or two states that try to make their restrictions worse, and we have one or two states where the incumbents, the big telephone companies, try to get laws passed that restrict community broadband. In those, especially in those fights, that's where we need to have a presence of folks in the telemedicine industry, right? Because people will stand up and listen if you say, well, one of the reasons that we need to have broadband and municipal broadband as an option, right, is that it will affect how well we can get telehealth out there in those underserved areas, right? But that participation with the other organizations and cities and so forth that fight at the state level, okay, this needs to be, a fight that is also joined by people in the telehealth area. And just so you have there is just this is a look of which states have carrier of last resort requirements. And I would pretty much guarantee you that in many of those states, those blue states and the ones that have implicit requirements, there are efforts being made to undo those requirements. And the thing, and why they get away with those things is people aren't paying attention. A lot of people don't know that that is actually even being discussed. So the same as there's a map, I guess maps that show where we have good telehealth policy. You need to look at the states that have good broadband policy, in my humble opinion. And then there are the municipality policies, where ultimately you're talking about, do they have policies that make it easier for companies, small or large, to be able to bring broadband into that city or county. You will often, there'll be some sort of policy that tries to ensure there is competition, because if there is competition in the broadband space, if it's not just Comcast or just AT&T providing services, right, you will get a better deal. You'll get better policy. You'll get better likelihood that you won't have to worry about will my telemedicine app be slowed down by the big companies. Okay, so what is the city doing to affect that? And then there is the how does the facility, the community facilitates community-owned broadband? Right. So there was an article yesterday that said that a city in Colorado, um, there's a restriction in Colorado that says you have to have a vote in order to for a referendum in order to get broadband. Right. A city in Colorado said, you know what, these are turning into a farce where the incumbents spend lots and lots of money to try to affect the outcome of um, uh, the vote, right? So this particular city just said, you know what, we are going to not do that process. We're not going to have. We will get our feedback and we'll get validation and everything from the city, from the residents and so forth. But we're not going to go through a formal voting process. I have mixed feelings about this, but this is an example of a city policy that is affecting community-owned broadband. Um, I would say that I sort of looked at the different aspects of the telemedicine world and said, well, you have the associations, and those are probably the bodies that will fight for good broadband policy or partner with other organizations that are trying to get good broadband at the federal level. I think that they're the best equipped to get into that DC um, process. There are the telehealth resource centers, which there are 2 national groups and 12 um, regional groups, and one of their purposes in being is to affect policy at the state and the federal level. If you do not know, who or what is the TRC in your area, you might want to take some time to get to know them because they are there to make your life better. Whether you're talking about the hospitals or the healthcare providers, or we're talking about those who are selling services, okay? But those folks are an ally. And I had a conversation with the national organization, and they're very much aware of the correlation between broadband and telehealth, and so they are very much aware and following policy discussions that affect broadband. So get to those. Then you have the providers. I'm sorry, um, the service vendors, the product vendors, and so forth. When we are dealing with some of these state battles to keep good laws on the books regarding municipal broadband, it is often very beneficial to have some of the bigger names in an industry be part of that fight. It's not always a fight, but there are times when it's like Georgia, for example. Georgia went out of its way to assess the needs of broadband throughout the state, and this is an example where the vendors can have an impact on the broadband policy that can affect them. So it's in your best interest to to follow this. And then the healthcare facilities, the healthcare professionals, and so forth. I would say that they're where you can have the biggest impact is at the state and the city level, because that's where I think your ability to talk about telemedicine, telehealth, healthcare in general can be brought to bear, and you can actually see results for your efforts. And then to close, some of the folks that you might want to partner with, you folks in the telehealth world, right? The same as there are state and national legislators who are friends of telehealth, there are friends of broadband, and sometimes they may be the same people, but you need to find out, well, who influences broadband decisions at the state level and the national level, so that you can affect what they're doing and making sure that broadband policy helps telehealth, right? You have the various policy and activist organizations and associations. So similar to the TRCs, there are different organizations in broadband or in the broadband world that fight these battles, that speak out on behalf of the consumers, the businesses, and so forth. You have vendors and ISPs, wireless ISPs, all of that private sector folks who are building broadband that are more in touch with the community level, right? You want to get, you want to work with them in helping to get better policies. And then ultimately, I think that the municipalities and the co-ops that are building these networks, and by the way, there are 750 either city governments, county governments, or co-ops that are building these networks, and all of them are going to affect um, how adequate is the broadband in those areas that a lot of the telemedicine uh, vendors are trying to reach. So that's I think the lay of the land there. And so I'll turn it over to Milton now, and we can go with some questions, and then you folks in the audience can um, put in your questions as well.
Great, thanks for sharing your insight with us. I think one thing I'm curious about, you probably like our audience is very, entrepreneur driven. There's a lot of people in the audience against they want to use telehealth to not only impact people but also build successful business in there. I know, for example, like the USDA, FCC, you have a lot of these grants out there to support it. I mean, is there a way for this telehealth company to some method to get some access to those grant capital to like fund their companies and so on?
Well, the federal agencies typically have a process, and this is actually one of these sort of the bones of contention, is that when the broadband stimulus started in 2009, one of the big contention points was that there was a lot of money, but a lot of times it was going to the people like Verizon and Comcast and so forth, and not giving any money or not enough money to local organizations or just other entities that have the ability to impact building these networks, right? And so it's a divide that has to be addressed. And even as recently as yesterday, right when I posted information about this webinar, and one of my followers said, it's good to have local involvement because they're often doing broadband right. However, the policies that address funding are very backwards, in my opinion, and very politically driven, and so it is difficult to influence that. Now, at the state level, there are grants and funds as well. And I would say that you may have better luck being able to lobby those folks to make sure that if you've got a good idea and you can bring people to the table, then they will be more responsive. So, for example, Minnesota has a policy of we're going to get border to border broadband coverage, right? And so they have various policies that reflect that goal,
I
right?
guess,
That's where you want to have
yeah. I guess,
participation.
I mean, typically, like working with the government, a lot of times something very, lengthy process in there. Like, is there like a list somewhere like audience can go to see, like, here's a list of whether like a municipality, whatever, then they just gotta borrow, bucket of money for some broadband
Mhm.
initiative. Then people can sort of hard, like reach out to those to plug in
Right.
some like because I'm looking for like, is there any practical tips you can offer to access those capital?
Okay, so I would say number one, I've created a list, and it'll be ongoing, be updated regularly, of various resources, including a map that shows where cities are building. Um, there are I'll have a couple of what is it? Some of the policy, some of the federal agencies that are um, spending money, and so subsequently you can go out to those. And I'm writing a report that will be out in about 3 weeks that's looking at broadband and how telemedicine and broadband need to come together.
Okay.
And those in that, I will list different organizations that are um, involved, right?
Okay. Got
I think that
it.
you have to also look at maybe foundations and so forth that will, because they are funding um, telehealth initiatives, you could probably go to them and make a case that we want to build or we want to partner with a group that will build um, uh, broadband, and then we will then work with them to get telemedicine out to their constituents and so forth.
Got it. Okay. So quick, we have a question from the audience, Frank Chen, asking about, how would the net neutrality, the recently just all the hoopla in the capital apply to telemedicine? In some sense, the part of the question I'm assuming is like, you could often do telemedicine with fairly low bandwidth in there. I mean, do you feel like the net neutrality might have an impact or?
I think the impact that net neutrality will have specifically for telehealth is um, what the FCC has done with the net neutrality issue is they basically have taken away all of the rules. So all of the safeguards, all of the procedures that were put into place to make sure that as a vendor, you won't be treated unfairly by AT&T, because AT&T has its own telemedicine application or friend or partner or whatever. right? So the biggest thing is that the rules are going away, and you may not see the effect immediately, and it may be subtle in terms of the effect that it'll have. But I would say that it comes down to your access to customers will be affected. Your operation of the telemedicine apps will be affected. And just another further example, right? A number of companies, and I've talked to a number of, and also I've talked to you as well, right? You are building applications that don't take a lot of bandwidth,
Yeah.
right? And that's good and so forth. But then when you have a situation where the network is oversubscribed,
Mm.
and so you can't get the
Sure.
capacity,
Okay.
right? That's
So
when
yeah,
you get affected.
understand. Quick, we have another question from the audience, and Dane is asking, so are there other technologies available to get these sort of medical professionals and patients connected, so besides like broadband?
Wow. I mean, either you go by the internet or you go with what's considered a intranet, so you can
My
have.
hunch, my hunch thing probably is not asking so much about, maybe it's like, you think of broadband as things like, like maybe, so whether cell or cable or DSL in there. Is the other way maybe to connect to like these, some of the remote locations then?
Oh, do you have? Well, I mean, you can ultimately you have to have some sort of pipe
Yeah.
that moves the data from one place to the other. And so your options are, I mean, you can do fiber, you can do wireless, you
Okay.
can do satellite, though I don't consider that to be great, but it's, if you have nothing else, then okay. Um, and you can have this infrastructure as either a public access through the internet, or you can have a private access.
Okay.
But I mean, unless I'm missing something,
Okay.
telemedicine has to move data from one point to the other.
Yeah,
And,
my hunch is that if I were to guess, then I apologize if I'm putting words into your mouth. My hunch is, for example, take maybe Native American reservations in there, right? They're very challenging to get broadband in there. So supposing I want to launch a mass telemedicine program in, let's say for cover Native American reservation across the US, what are the options, from satellite to long range Wi-Fi, laser, like is there option that, practical option?
I think you still come back to the issue that if I wanted to bring telemedicine to a Native tribe, okay, you've got to either build the connection, or you have people show up that have the connection. So, for example, in Kansas, and this is my report that I did in November, right? In Kansas, they have a hospital and several clinics, and then they have people, doctors, and their staff will go to different clinics in rural areas that don't have very good broadband connection, and they bring the broadband with them. They bring transmitters and all that kind of stuff that will provide uh, 20 megs of service, but it's only when they're there, right? But it's a
Okay.
way to bring. You can bring it to that. There's a company called Mobile Beacon,
Okay.
which is they make uh, portable Wi-Fi thing. You can just take them, as long as there is a cellular company like either
Okay.
Sprint or T-Mobile, right? You can use that device in your home to deal with broadband, right? So they're testing now an application that will allow, say, someone who has to be monitored for the next 2 months or even just 2 days, right? Where they
Yeah.
can go to the library, get one of these devices, and go to their home, and then they would have internet, temporary internet, obviously, but it's along those lines that you're talking about, where the, the residents don't have good broadband. What is the alternative? Well, and then you have to bring it in some other way to
Okay.
get.
So Greg, we're coming down the end of the hour, and
Oh, wow.
I think I would like to maybe just ask you three quick questions. If you could
Sure.
give a limit to just one sentence answer, that'll just help. So the first one is, today you shared a bunch of different things with us. What is like, if the audience could only learn from you one thing, like what is that one thing you want the audience to learn from you?
Broadband policy affects your ability to deliver your telehealth to your audiences. Plain
Okay.
and simple. And
But my hunch is for that one is you probably I would love to email you maybe to write a follow, but to be more maybe specific, my hunch is for the telehealth crowd, if you say it like that way, then they just say like, it doesn't matter in there. So if you focus on maybe some concrete, on this thing wouldn't work, but that thing work, then you could get the whole community rally behind you.
And I
Um,
think the telehealth community needs to make it abundantly clear in the different audiences, how important broadband
okay,
is, and because I don't think we fully
okay,
understand from both sides that correlation. And so I guess the biggest thing is you got to tell people, right?
okay, okay,
It's good that, like, at your event, it was great that people came together, right? We got to somehow together figure out how to package that
okay,
knowledge to an audience that builds the
okay.
transfer.
So the next question is it something like the one thing you believe in around maybe broadband or digital health that the rest of the world do not believe in yet?
Hmm. Um, I guess the worst, if you believe that the incumbents like AT&T and Comcast and all these guys, if you think they're going to be the solution to broadband, you're not. It's not going to, in certain areas. It's just not going.
Got it. Okay. So the final question is, so if you could meet and whisper an idea into President Trump's ear about maybe broadband or digital health, telemedicine, right? Like what would you tell him to do?
We got to bring serious competition to broadband, because that is, when you look at all the problems and why people don't have broadband in different parts of the country and so forth, it ultimately comes down to there isn't competition. And he's supposed to be the business guy and the art of the deal and all that kind of stuff. This is what we got to have. Either we have it
Uh-huh.
and we have good broadband, or we won't get it. There's not a whole
Got
lot
it.
of in between on that.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much, Craig, for sharing your insight with us. Okay, Anne, can you bring up the announcement slide?
I'm sorry, say it again.
Oh, no, I'm asking Anne if she
Oh,
could
sorry.
bring up the announcements. Okay, great. Okay. Craig, again, just thank you so much for sharing insights. I think it's like broadband is like the road, right? Without it, the telemedicine will not work. Thanks for sharing your industry insight on there. I guess for the audience, I would like to share a couple of things. We are annual conference, the Telehealth Fair Secret to Success. We finally picked the date. Okay, October 2nd through the 4th in the Silicon Valley in there. Again, we'll love to, again, registration just open there. Definitely sign up for the early bird discount in there. We're pretty excited. I think this year we have some lineups are really like a mega big speakers coming to. I think you could be wow. Plus all the dealings and creating companies, all the things happening on the sidebar conversation. We're pretty excited. And our next webinar is going to focus on March 1st. So focus on the telesurgery, specifically the Google Glass, augmented reality. Again, a lot of the hype and failure in that space. We're going to deep dive that a little bit. I think you're going to really enjoy how some of the insight you can learn from there. And then again, so we're actually also, our company is gearing up for ATA. So we have actually the largest booth of the entire show. We beat out everyone in there. So we have a bunch of partners exhibiting inside our booth. We have talks. Again, it's going to be pretty exciting. So if you're interested to partner with us at the ATA, contact Becky. Again, we'll do a lot of this marketing media before, after the shows. Again, we also have two competition we're running. One is artificial intelligence machine learning competition in Vietnam. That's actually pretty exciting. So we're going to actually take a lot of these for the machine learning approach, a lot of these digital health data. So if you're interested, send us a note and we'll get you involved on there. And then another thing is we have our motorcycle boat design competition in Southeast Asia. Again, so actually the conference will be held in November timeframe. Again, we're pretty excited. So we're going to get to design some boats and motorcycle that can have a big impact, the rural healthcare. It's again just like there. So then lastly is we're continuing doing a lot of work with writing our blueprint for decreasing the cost of healthcare by 50%. Again, using things like outcome, price, transparency. Again, if you're interested, definitely contact us. Again, thank you so much for everyone who tuned in. And Greg, again, thank you so much for sharing your insight with us.
No worries. Glad to help.
Great. Okay, thanks.